Chosen one, listen up, because this part is for you. Yes, you, the one who's been doubted, overlooked, counted out, and maybe even told to tone it down. The one who felt that sting when you spoke your truth and the room got quiet. Not because you were wrong, but because you hit a nerve. This isn't just content. This is a call, a reminder, a fire starter. You're not here by accident. You didn't stumble into this moment. You've survived things others wouldn't dare whisper about. And somehow, you're still standing. Stronger, louder, clearer. You've got a voice that shakes the room, a story that can't be erased, and a presence that wasn't built to blend in. So, if you've ever felt like your boldness was too much, your clarity was intimidating, or your truth made people uncomfortable, good. That means you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Because people like you don't just speak, you spark movement. You shift atmospheres, you walk in, and something changes. This space right here, it's for the ones who refuse to bow, refuse to shrink, and refuse to be rewritten. You're not just welcome, you're needed. So breathe in, sit up, shake off that last layer of doubt they tried to drape over you. You're not watching from the sidelines anymore. You're stepping into the spotlight they swore you'd never reach. Let's talk truth. Let's break patterns. Let's remind the world that your voice was never the problem. It was always the threat. Let's get into it. Looking for purpose and peace? Hit subscribe and start the journey. They weren't trying to dim your voice. They were trying to rewrite the air in the room so you never breathed in it again. This wasn't about volume or behavior. It was about erasure. You unsettled the equilibrium they built on illusion, not because you were combative, but because you simply existed without pretending. Just your being there sent a ripple through their false sense of security. Words weren't necessary. Your silence was a trigger. The way you stood, observed, or simply blinked made everything unstable, like a structure realizing it was built on shifting ground. Your presence didn't challenge them because it opposed them. It dismantled the lies they rehearsed. Without accusation or confrontation, you disrupted the performance. You weren't loud, you were real. And reality doesn't beg for acceptance, it just is. That's what unsettled them. They didn't crave reconciliation. They sought erasure. Not a quieter version of you, but an alternate timeline where your clarity had never entered the room. A version where the questions you made people asked themselves never echoed. But what they failed to anticipate was that you weren't a projection they could delete. You were a signal sent by something beyond their reach. Even cut out, you kept resonating. Even silenced, your fingerprint remained on everything. They followed from shadows, trying to replicate what they couldn't possess, mistaking essence for style. What terrified them wasn't what you said. It was that you never needed to say anything to be believed. Make your impact eternal. Join now and be a light in someone's darkness. Their aim was never stillness. It was submission. And when you refused to dissolve into compliance, their script crumbled. You weren't erased. You were written into memory by the very force that tried to forget you. Now, no matter how they rearrange the story, the part you played can't be redacted. This wasn't just about sound or speech. It was about the tectonic shift your expression sparked beneath the surface. It didn't simply rattle comfort zones. It shattered deeply embedded patterns shaped by centuries of suppression. What emerged from you wasn't noise or rebellion. It was essence, stripped from layers of inherited silence. Not theory, not reaction. Something carved out of lived awareness, scar tissue, and sacred defiance. As your words took shape, people began to stir, not always in agreement, but never in indifference. You weren't echoing what they were used to. You were speaking in a frequency that made old narratives unravel. Your tone didn't match the script. They couldn't predict your cadence, your rhythm, your insight. You didn't come rehearsed, and that unpredictability felt like danger to those clinging to control. You weren't just interrupting a conversation. You were short-circuiting an illusion. You unearthed the unspoken and held it to the light without apology. It wasn't that you said too much. It was that you revealed too clearly. What you voiced didn't fit inside their labels. It resisted dilution. It exposed what was hiding in plain sight, and that kind of truth doesn't sit quietly. That's why attempts were made to distort you, to reframe you as unstable, exaggerated, or too much. It was easier to dismantle your image than to confront what your clarity awakened. Because real change doesn't arrive in slogans, it shows up as discomfort, resistance, reflection. You invited all three, and many would have rather stayed numb. If your heart overflows with divine love, now is the moment to let it shine. Click the super thank you button on YouTube and give $50 or more to help carry God's light to others. Your gift will bless not only your life, but countless others. You are part of His sacred plan. Your kindness may be the answer to someone's prayer. Share your blessings and honor His kingdom. May His grace guide you always. And still, you didn't shrink. You continued, not to provoke, but because the weight inside had to be released. What you carried wasn't for applause. It was an assignment. Each word released widened the crack in the illusion. Each pause, a tremor. Each truth, a match to dry kindling. That's what made you dangerous. Not because you manipulated, but because you liberated. They never imagined that someone with your history, your wounds, your soul's architecture would become a voice no one could overwrite. And now, the distortion has failed. The fracture has spread. What you spoke can't be swallowed. What you freed won't return to its cage. They weren't prepared for someone who arrived not just with feelings, but with footprints traced through fire. If it had been only frustration, they could have shrugged it off, labeled it as overreaction, dismissed it with a smirk and a condescending phrase. That's how countless voices have been buried under accusations of exaggeration and hysteria. But this wasn't that. This was something else entirely. This was clarity built from lived chaos. What came out wasn't noise. It was chronology. It was memory sharpened by pain, detail refined by survival. There was no room left for denial. Not when every sentence was anchored in actual experience. Not when the delivery was shaped by storms that left nothing untouched. There was nothing abstract about it. This wasn't theory. It was blood on the floor turned into language. What unsettled them most wasn't tone. It was precision. You spoke with the kind of accuracy that only the hurt can wield, the kind of accuracy that disarms excuses. There was no rage to mask the truth, just the truth itself, standing bare, offering no place to hide. And it didn't come with demands. It didn't need to. Presence alone pulled back the curtain. They couldn't refute what you carried, so they tried to distort it. Scrambling to stitch together a new narrative, they hoped to redirect attention. But the attempt was hollow. You weren't theorizing. You were the unwelcome proof that their version of events was incomplete. Every time you showed up, their facade cracked a little more. Not because you were loud, but because what you embodied contradicted their script. And that's what made you uncontainable. You didn't recite something you learned. You became the evidence they couldn't erase. The story wasn't spoken. It was worn. It was visible, and it resisted all revision. No smear tactic, no whispered doubt, no reshaped retelling could bury what had already been exposed. And now, The truth walks freely, etched into you, unable to be undone. Make your impact eternal. Join now and be a light in someone's darkness. It wasn't rage or rebellion that unsettled the structure. It was the sheer refusal to comply. Not with noise, not with aggression, but with unwavering clarity. The kind that quietly says, "This performance no longer has my participation." That single decision rippled outward like a frequency that pierced walls they thought were soundproof. The collapse didn't need sabotage. It came from the weight of truth-meeting architecture built on pretense. You didn't set out to ruin reputations. You simply existed without distortion, and in a space addicted to illusion, that was more than enough. Authenticity has a way of rearranging the room before a word is spoken. What you revealed wasn't revelation to all. It was recognition. You named what others had disguised as normal. You didn't dress up your experience or adjust your tone to soothe discomfort. You didn't cover for their missteps. Instead, you held up a clear reflection, and that mirror disrupted the dream. Their fear wasn't rooted in your message. It lived in what your message unlocked in others. You didn't just offer testimony, you awakened recollection. Eyes started shifting. Minds began to string together memories they'd hidden behind habit. Suddenly, their well-maintained silence wasn't enough to hold it all in place. The pushback wasn't always loud. Sometimes it arrived in carefully orchestrated distance, polite avoidance, coded disapproval. Isolation was never about your actions. It was insurance against your influence. If you were labeled a problem, others might hesitate before tracing their own path back to reality. You didn't throw fire, you cracked the script. Once the illusion broke, so did the obedience that held it. They weren't worried about your presence. They were panicked by what followed behind it. You weren't dangerous because you shouted. You were dangerous because you stopped hiding. And that's what changed everything. When you stood fully visible, the room could no longer pretend it didn't see. The choice became clear for everyone watching. Cling to the performance or confront the truth in their own reflection. Many chose to rise, not in allegiance to you, but in revolt against the lie they unknowingly served. If your heart overflows with divine love, now is the moment to let it shine. Click the super thank you button on YouTube and give $50 or more to help carry God's light to others. Your gift will bless not only your life, but countless others. You are part of His sacred plan. Your kindness may be the answer to someone's prayer. Share your blessings and honor His kingdom. May His grace guide you always. What unnerved them wasn't your disobedience. It was your decision to no longer shrink into spaces carved by fear. You stepped beyond the invisible boundaries others tiptoe around, not with defiance, but with certainty. You began to speak in a rhythm unfamiliar to those still rehearsing roles handed down in silence. The rhythm of true liberation. Not the one they quote, but the one that costs everything. This kind of freedom doesn't ask permission. It severs expectations. It lets go of inherited guilt and walks through doors others don't dare touch. And in doing that, you didn't disturb peace. You revealed the chains beneath it. That was the rupture. Not your voice, but the realization that you'd stopped wearing the script. No walls were shaken by rage. It was recognition that caused the disruption. When you named the patterns others normalized, when you told the truth without apology, something shifted. The facade many clung to started to lose its shape. You weren't challenging order. You were revealing its rot. They weren't angry at chaos. They were threatened by your clarity. You reflected things they tried to rename, to sanitize, to bury under loyalty and tradition. You peeled back the disguise, and the air grew sharp with discomfort. That's why they didn't just disagree. They distanced, whispered, made you the villain of a story they built on avoidance. You didn't break the room. You opened the windows, and the breeze of honesty stung faces unprepared for it. Their outrage wasn't about what you revealed. It was about what it made others see in themselves. You reminded them of the choice they'd been postponing. Keep defending the lie, or finally admit they've outgrown it. And while they tried to exile your truth, you walked freer each time. You weren't reacting, you were releasing. There was no need to persuade, only to shed. What offended them wasn't rebellion. It was your refusal to nod along. And in doing so, you became the invitation they couldn't unhear, no matter how much they tried to silence its echo. What kept you grounded wasn't validation, wasn't attention, wasn't strategy. It was calling. That's the part they couldn't dismantle. Every attempt to box you in failed, because your rise wasn't man-made. They thought removing support would collapse your path, but they misunderstood what built it. You weren't following applause, you were following alignment. Their games were based on influence, but your momentum had nothing to do with their approval. When one hallway closed, another corridor opened, not because you pushed, but because something greater was clearing space ahead. Their systems didn't fuel you. Their rejection didn't drain you. Their silence didn't stop you. You were never rooted in what they offered. That's what left them frustrated. While they operated on visibility and influence, you moved from something untouched by mood swings and gossip. They couldn't cancel what wasn't crafted for popularity. You weren't a product of networking or trend. You were instruction in motion. No edit, no rumor, no exclusion could override that. Every failed attempt to diminish you only highlighted how little control they had to begin with. You weren't bouncing back. You were expanding, often in places they didn't even see. And that made you untraceable by their metrics. Your presence wasn't held up by likes. It was woven into something timeless. You were never meant to be agreeable. You were meant to shake the dust off truths long buried. You weren't here to be understood by everyone. You were here to activate what can't stay dormant. Their resistance didn't delay you. It just made your purpose unmistakable. Because what's set into motion by deeper design can't be paused by surface noise. They struggled to categorize what they couldn't corner. Every attempt to assign you a role failed. Too grounded to dismiss, too composed to vilify, too unfiltered to sanitize. You moved outside the boundaries of their mental frameworks, and that disarmed the very tools they relied on to reduce people. You weren't acting. You weren't performing. You were simply too honest to be controlled. Each attempt to label you slipped through their grasp. You didn't wear the costume of the broken or the polished. You weren't desperate for sympathy or approval. You didn't play the hero or the villain. And that refusal to comply, to mold yourself into a caricature they could explain away, fractured their sense of order. They tried praise, hoping you'd soften. They tried slander, hoping you'd retreat. They even tried to blur your reflection, confuse the crowd with conflicting versions of you. One moment too bold, the next not bold enough. Their strategy wasn't to prove you wrong, it was to exhaust the audience into uncertainty. But the truth didn't fade. It showed up not in speeches or spectacle, but in the way you lived. Your evolution spoke louder than their narratives. Your growth disrupted their framework. You didn't counter lies with counterclaims. You just kept embodying something they couldn't touch: consistency without compromise. Over time, masks started slipping. Not yours, but theirs. You didn't expose them with accusations. You exposed them with existence. The more they tried to distort you, the more your wholeness sharpened into focus. You couldn't be outlined because you were never designed to fit the canvas they painted on. You were never here to be simplified. You were here to dismantle the need for false categories altogether. That's why the noise around you grew while your truth remained steady. Not because you were flawless, but because you never needed a frame to be real. What stirred the space wasn't rebellion, it was unwavering calm. You weren't demanding attention, yet you became impossible to ignore. Where others performed strength through noise, you stood still and let presence do the work. That stillness became a shift. They didn't expect you to remain upright. They expected compromise, concession, collapse. Instead, you held your form, not by force, but by self-knowledge, and that unsettled everything. You didn't seek conflict, but your clarity dissolved false harmony without raising your voice. They couldn't understand how someone without a title or permission could move the room. But it wasn't volume that made the difference. It was alignment. You didn't argue, plead, or provoke. You just stopped pretending. And in a space where performance was the norm, authenticity rang like thunder. Without pointing fingers, you became the evidence that choice was possible. That submission wasn't the only option. That quiet strength existed beyond survival. People began to see in your example what they hadn't dared to believe, that integrity could coexist with peace. You weren't leading a campaign, you were living a truth, and that alone cracked illusions that had been propped up for years. Not with explosions, but with presence. Not with noise, but with steadiness. You didn't have to push. They felt the shift the moment you decided you would no longer bend. The message wasn't in your words, it was in your refusal to yield. That silent resistance echoed louder than confrontation. And those echoes started unlocking what fear had kept chained. Without aiming to be a symbol, you became one of something unshaken, of something unbought, of something free. They mistook your silence for defeat, not realizing the pause was preparation. While they plotted your disappearance, they built the very stage where your return would thunder. What they assumed was your final chapter turned out to be the quiet before an awakening they could not anticipate. They weren't trying to just step over you. They tried to erase your blueprint altogether, and in doing so, they handed you the very material you needed to rise stronger. This wasn't just betrayal, it was exposure. They didn't simply walk away, they orchestrated your exile. They needed others to abandon you, to believe the story they curated. It was strategic, not emotional. But their calculation missed the core. You weren't meant to disappear. You were meant to root deeper. Every attempt to shut the door forced you to find the lock within yourself. Every rumor, every smirk, every disinvitation only revealed how little they understood the force they'd tried to contain. You were never being erased. You were being refined. And what looked like silence became the forge where your strength took shape. The loss, the loneliness, the attempts to smear your name, those didn't diminish you. They turned into fuel. What they called your collapse was really your becoming. And while they were watching for weakness, they missed the shift. You didn't resurface to reclaim approval. You emerged to fulfill purpose. Their rejection became the backdrop to your revelation. They thought you needed their backing, but all you needed was to remember who you were without their distortion. You didn't need to clap back. You didn't need to retaliate. Your continued rising said everything. Now their version of events is losing grip. The louder they try to shout you down, the clearer your presence becomes, not because you shouted back, but because truth doesn't need an audience to echo. And every person who hears what you lived through, every heart that relates to your return, weakens the hold their false narrative once had. The platform wasn't built for you, it was built from you. And what they tried to bury keeps growing roots in places they cannot reach. It wasn't what left your lips that caused the tension. It was what you refused to swallow. No need for confrontation, no need for spectacle, just one simple decision. You weren't going to lie to yourself anymore. That alone was enough to fracture the whole arrangement. Everyone else was nodding, pretending the script made sense. You didn't play along, you didn't fake amusement, you didn't offer agreement to keep your seat at a table built on denial. And that pause, that refusal to join in the unspoken pact, echoed far louder than any shouted protest ever could. What disrupted the space wasn't rebellion, it was your unwillingness to betray your instincts. You didn't join the performance, and suddenly, the production started looking strange to everyone else. You were the unscheduled silence in a room full of rehearsed applause. That's what made people shift in their chairs. You didn't dismantle the system, you just stopped feeding it. And once one person stopped pretending, others began to question what they had normalized. Your clarity wasn't combative, it was contagious. You gave shape to thoughts they couldn't articulate. You gave people back their own voice by using yours sparingly and sincerely. Some reacted with anger, not because you wounded them, but because you reminded them of the parts they buried to belong. Others felt liberated. The tension wasn't from volume, it was from truth, brushing against denial. And once seen, it could not be unseen. You weren't there to shame anyone. You were there to stay whole. And in doing so, you cracked something open that had been sealed too long. The real shift didn't come from your statement. It came from the silence you refused to mask with compliance. That's why your presence lingered. That's why your stillness roared. Not because you said it all, but because you refused to pretend nothing needed to be said.